Thank you so much, Bertrand. And thank you so much to Heidi and Amy as well. I'm really looking forward to teasing out some of the links between the different things we're saying. Welcome everybody to Luddite's Corner. I'm afraid I don't have anything to put it behind you, so sort of from feast with Amy to famine with me, I'm afraid. I want to try and make two arguments in this paper. The first one is that the way that many colonists thought about the lands they were colonizing can be understood in terms of the way that the West came to understand itself. And that's what I mean by generalized coloniality. And in the first half of the paper, I want to tease through how we get from one to the other. The second argument that I want to try and make, specifically from Rousseau, is that the way that many early colonists thought about the lands they were colonizing actually also makes sense of the way that the modern West thinks about personal identity today, perhaps somewhat surprisingly. I want to try and show how I think that works. And I want to do both of those through this idea of the state of nature, this early modern idea that comes to the fore really in Hobbes. And by the time we get to Rousseau, it's already on the way out. He's problematizing it a lot in the second discourse, but he still uses it a lot. And in order to make sense of the state of nature, I want to try and approach it as a theoretical object. What moves is it making? How is the state of nature functioning theoretically? I think it's doing three things. Everyone who talks about the state of nature, including Rousseau, talks about a flat space. So the state of nature, singular, no differentiation. So whatever land the colonizers came to that was in the state of nature was treated as the same. There's no essential difference. It's flattened in that sense. The second thing that it does theoretically is it creates one major division in that flatness, one major partition. And this is a partition between, on the one side, the state of nature itself and the quote-unquote savages who inhabit it, and on the other side, what Hobbes calls a commonwealth, or what Rousseau will call it a civil society, the European nations who do the colonizing. So that single partition makes sense of the world for these writers. And the third aspect of the state of nature as a theoretical object is that it normalizes one side of that partition. It makes a value judgment about one side of that partition. Now, for Hobbes and Locke, this is very unambiguous. State of nature, bad. Civil society or commonwealth, good. In Rousseau, as you would expect from him, it's a lot more complex than that. And the textual armature of the second discourse, with its sort of proliferation of paratext, is problematizing this distinction, but nevertheless, he still uses it. And I think it still works for him. So flattening, partition, normalization. So let's trace through how that makes sense of the colonial experience and then of the West more broadly. So the colonizers experienced the land as flat and undifferentiated. The cultural historian Willie James Jennings writes about the deracinated experience of land. So up until this point, the almost universal experience of land was people belonged somewhere, and you identified yourself in terms of where you were from. You ate the produce of a particular area, and it quite literally made you up physically as a person. Now, of course, none of that cultural memory, none of that physical affinity was there when people arrived in colonial lands, and there was a new imaginary of the land. Not in terms of how it's different from other lands, but simply how it can be exploited. It is a resource. How can this be made use of? Very different way of understanding land, very flattened. The partition that makes sense, that creates meaning within this land, and this is really obvious in John Locke's second treatise, is the fundamental partition between productivity and the land being unproductive. So he talks about the land and the state of nature as being waste, which for him is the greatest of sins, because it's not being productive. We're not making a profit out of this land. Or there's land that is made productive. And in the second treatise, it's quite funny. He starts saying you can make 10 times the amount of money that the inhabitants of the land are currently making, then a little bit further on, 100 times. And he ends up with 1,000 times as much. That's what it's about for him, that partition. And of course, what is normalized in that case is productivity. So these three figures, flattening, partition, normalization, make sense of the colonial experience, the experience of the colonizers, of the lands where they landed. Now, this is where I think it gets a bit interesting, hopefully gets a bit interesting. Those same three figures also come back again and again and again in the way that a whole string of theorists try to understand Western modernity. So take Charles Taylor, for example, in A Secular Age. He talks about what some theorists have called the flight to the cities, when rural populations gathered in cities in the early Industrial Revolution. He talks about it as a disembedding from the land. So people were no longer identified primarily with the very particular bits of land they came from, because they weren't there anymore, the land that their ancestors had lived on. And that is exactly the same experience of land as the colonizers had. Or think, for example, about the partition. Bruno Latour, in Nous n'avons jamais été modernes, talks about two great divides that for him encapsulate what modernity is all about. The first great divide he calls the internal great divide. It's the divide within European societies between nature and culture, through which he says those societies make sense of the world. And again, it's very reminiscent, isn't it, of this state of nature, civil society distinction. And the second great divide is even closer, what he calls the external great divide, which is the divide between quote unquote civilization, the European nations on the one hand, and savagery or barbarism on the other, as they would have put it at the time. So the way in which these are talked about are also very normalized. Even the term savagery is so drippingly loaded with condescension as it is. Describe the way in which modernity articulates itself. And therefore, to the extent that this is correct, the argument that I want to try and make, and perhaps we'll need to defend later on, I'm not sure, is that the modern West exists in a condition that we could call generalized coloniality. That imaginary of the world that was first experienced by the colonizers has come to be the general imaginary of land, of space, that characterizes the dominant ideology in the West today. We exist in a condition, we the West exist in a condition of generalized coloniality. That's the first argument. The second one, more specifically from Rousseau, is that this experience of land also makes sense of the way that the late modern West, I guess, thinks about personal identity. Let me try and make this argument in 3 steps. There are 3 things that Hobbes and Locke talk about in terms of land that Rousseau talks about in terms of the self. There's a systematic transfer from land to self. The first way that this happens is in terms of potential. So if you read through Locke's second treatise, what gets him really giddy is that the land that is in the state of nature has great potential. Think how much use we could make of this. Think how many trees we could chop down and sell. Think what profit could be made. It is a space that he talks of in a discourse of potential. Now, Rousseau doesn't, interestingly, in the second discourse, but he does use the language of potential in relation to human beings. So Rousseau temporalizes human beings in a way that neither Hobbes nor Locke do. We fundamentally change over time. And he talks about the quote-unquote savages in the state of nature using this same discourse of potential. I just want to read a quotation from Judith Shklar, the Rousseau scholar, in her book, what's he called? Man and Citizen. And she writes this, he writes of Rousseau talking about the savage as, quote, the man of pure sensation, being shorn of every attribute that might conceivably be social in its origin, who has nothing within him except, underline, his potentialities. So this whole idea of potential is transferred to the human being. The second thing that's transferred to the human being in the second discourse is that the logic and the discourse of perfectibility. Now, again, this is something that's right there on the surface in Locke, but he talks about land as perfectible. The word that he keeps using is the improvement of the land, by which he means the exploitation of land, the use of Western agricultural practices on the land. Again, Rousseau uses the same language, but he doesn't talk about land in that way. He talks about the individual in that way. So if you go through the second discourse and underline every mention of perfectibility, it's in relation to you and to me, to human beings. That is the locus, the space that is now conceived as perfectible. And in the same way that something that you see when you read accounts of early colonizers is a sense of the land as a project, almost a blank canvas onto which they can and often did project their wildest fantasies. In Rousseau, we begin to see emerging something that I think has become clearer since Rousseau, the idea of the self as a project, as something that can be made and constructed in the same way that the blank canvas of the state of nature was seen as something that needed to be made and constructed by these early colonizers. And again, Willie James Jennings writes in ways that really resonate with this. He, from his research, says that one thing that keeps coming back is the idea of the disorientation of identity that the early colonizers felt. He has this striking phrase, "Who am I in this strange new place?" I knew who I was back home. I was part of the land, I was part of a family, I was part of certain social structures. None of that is here now. So who am I without these things? I need to make myself. I need to construct myself, partly out of my fantasies, as it happened. And he talks about, he uses the term self-designation. He's saying the colonizers self-designated in the new environment, shorn of the orienting factors that help them to make sense of themselves back home. And I think if we had longer, we could trace the genealogy of that self-designation back from the contemporary moment, where it is a dominant way that people seek to understand identity. I am who I make myself. I am a project, and I can make myself in ways that I see fit. I am not dictated to by my circumstances. I am not the prisoner of the factors that were present at my birth. The origin of this, there's certainly one historical origin of this, I think, is in this colonial experience, where people were perhaps for the first time shorn of all these orienting factors. So potential and perfectibility become part of the self. The third thing that is subjectivized, if you like, for Rousseau is the idea of alienation. So Hobbes and Locke have sort of proto-ideas of alienation if you work hard enough, but they're not to do with the individual. For Hobbes, of course, there's this idea of the war of all against all. It's a very social, very exterior sense of things being out of joint. For Locke, rather predictably, by this point in the talk, it's to do with the land. He has a bit of a land fixation in the second treatise. And for him, land that is not being exploited to its full is not fulfilling its true purpose. That, he says, for which God made it. So there's an alienation in the land when profit is not being drawn from it. Again, Rousseau takes this same shape of thinking, but for him, it's something that happens within you and me. We begin with this idea that he calls amour de soi-même. It's a healthy desire for self-preservation. It's a good thing, according to Rousseau. And as society progresses, we become burdened with this idea of amour propre, which is wanting to look better than everybody else, wanting to best everybody else, which he thinks is the great cancer that's eating away at modern society. And so within ourselves, we have these two fundamental principles with some footnotes and caveats around the edge, but we are fundamentally alienated from ourselves as modern people. And so again, this discourse is transferred within the self. And so systematically, I think what is happening is that Rousseau, knowingly or not, is taking these shapes of thinking that were previously used to talk about society in general or agricultural practices, and he's subjectivizing them. He's constructing a sense, the modern sense of the self, I think, out of these pieces that he sees lying around. And so the way that he thinks about identity, I think the case can be made that it's a dominant way of thinking about identity today, is built out of these pieces of the state of nature. And so the state of nature in that sense makes sense of, or at least provides a mirror that we can look at to see the shapes of and the assumptions behind the modern sense of self. Two quick conclusions from these two arguments. The first is to do with the center and the periphery. And I don't want to come over as being the first to say I am by no means. I'm sort of late to the party here, but it is still worth saying that this problematizes the relation between European metropolitan centre and colonial periphery. The idea that the flow of influence and ideas is only one way. If the way that the modern West constructs its imaginary of space and of identity as a fundamental colonial origin, that disrupts this idea of centre and periphery, of metropole and sort of colony. Second and final conclusion is that it disrupts, and I think this is something that I have to wrestle with, perhaps that we have to wrestle with as scholars, it blurs the line between critiquing the colonial imaginary and participating in it. It makes it hard to critique because, and this is, I think, where Rousseau doesn't quite do what he sets out to do. I think he sets out to critique it, but the problem is that he keeps this fundamental logic of flattening, partition and normalization. And in the first discourse, this is really clear. He just renormalizes the two, I think. And so now all the sort of negative language is reserved for modern Western society, and by and large, the positive language is reserved for the state of nature. Now, that is something of an inversion of this logic, but it's not a subversion of the logic, because he's still working in terms of this flattening, partition and normalization. That is indicative of the state of nature itself. It's just swapping round which side is normalized. And so I think the challenge for us as 21st century academics wrestling with these ideas is how to disrupt, subvert, or at least gain critical distance from not only the particular normalization that happened in the early modern period, but from the very logic that made that normalization possible. The flattening, partition and normalization that both Rousseau in his way and Hobbes and Locke in their way are participating in. I will leave that question hanging as I finish. Thank you.